I just said, yes, man, right away, anything.
Sorry, Thumpers, Dune, couldn't resist. Okay, moving on. So if you don't already know, a thumper is basically a secondary reaction vessel for your still. They work by piping the vapor in from your boiler into this tube all the way down to the bottom, so when the vapor comes through, it's going to be forced through some liquid that you have down in the bottom of your pot. When it hits that liquid, it bubbles and it thumps, hence the name, and that vapor cools down slightly and condenses inside the thumper until the heat that's being pumped in from the boiler brings the temperature of the entire system up. And once it gets up to heat, it's going to maintain that heat and start to redistill the liquid in here, turn it into vapor. Then that vapor climbs up and goes out this tube to your product condenser. It's basically a second boiler without its own heat source. And speaking of product condensers, I did a video recently on an easy product condenser build. I'll put the link right up there for you if you need it. As far as the liquid inside your thumper, it could be fruit juice, water, alcohol, some faints, lots of different choices, and we're going to get into that in future videos. But you don't really need more than about 3 inches of liquid, because as they run, thumpers can actually start to fill up, especially if you're running too hot. So you need to make sure you keep some serious headroom in there and don't put too much liquid in. Thumpers were initially added to stills in order to act as kind of a temperature control for wood-fired stills. They act kind of like a handbrake to slow things down if you get too much wood on the fire, but since we have adjustable flame propane or adjustable electric elements for stills, the temperature control feature doesn't really factor in anymore. The other feature about thumpers is the fact that it's actually a second distillation. I was talking to Jesse the other day and he compared it to adding a single plate, like a bubble plate with a really deep liquid level. And honestly, I think that's the best way to think about it, because it does increase the ABV of your output, but it's not doubling, despite some myths, and it's not a huge amount. If your normal output is 60%, you're not going to get 90 with a thumper. 10 to 15%, I think that's fair. But to me, the most important feature is the flavor enhancement that you can get on your final product, and the fact that having a thumper allows you to do different things that you can't do with a straight pot still. But that is a huge topic, and this is a build video, so we're going to get into that stuff in future videos. I don't mean to tease you with all that stuff. We're going to get there, but it's too much for this video, so let's go ahead and get on to the build. Alright, so the basic structure of any thumper is going to be pretty much the same. You have a vessel, some pipes, some sort of gasket material, and then some sort of way to connect it to the boiler side where the line arm comes in to the inlet, and then another connection point where it connects to the outlet side that goes to your condenser. And I recommend that you do something like this with kind of a modular design with connection points on it so that you can take it on and off. You're not going to want to use a thumper on every single run, and honestly, if you attach it so that it's permanent, then you have to use it. And also it makes it a huge pain in the butt to try and clean the thing. Now, to have an effective thumper, you need to have a reaction vessel that's between half and a third the size of your main boiler. So if you have, let's say, a 5-gallon boiler, then you need to have a reaction chamber on your thumper that's between 1.5 gallons to 2.5 gallons. And it should definitely be made of stainless steel or copper, not glass. There are tons of pictures and videos out there of people that have made thumpers or even a series of thumpers out of glass mason jars, and they look really cool and it's fun to watch the liquid dance around in there and everything. Don't do that. Don't do that. The problem is that they're incredibly dangerous. It's kind of like having a glass hand grenade on your still. They're just not made of the same stuff that like a distiller's grade sight glass would be made out of. So the possibility for catastrophic failure is very, very real. And honestly, having something that looks cool on your still is not worth it, considering that it could shatter and spray you with glass and boiling hot flammable alcohol, especially if you run a propane burner. So you remember what I was saying about the size? Thumpers need to be bigger than this. So not only is this dangerous as a thumper, it's just not very effective. And you may be saying, well, what about plated columns? You know, sight glass columns with a bubble plate in it. It's basically the same size as this. Yes, but the liquid in here goes in and then out. On a plated column, it goes up and then down over and over and over and over and over. So a plated column is way more effective than this. So you need to compensate and have something that has an appropriate size reaction chamber so that you're actually getting any benefit from having a thumper in the first place. And you'll be safer because it's made out of the right materials. So start off right and make it out of the right stuff. You guys are going to do whatever you want, but don't say I didn't warn you. So this pot is a 2-gallon stainless steel soup pot that I got from Walmart for about 14 bucks. And it did not come with these clips. If you look at the lid here, it's not super great. It doesn't fit that tight, but for what we're doing and the modifications we're gonna make to this, it's fine. The main thing is to make sure that it's stainless steel or copper or some sort of non-reactive metal. Since we need a way to secure the lid down, I got these spring-loaded clips from Amazon. These things are actually strangely hard to find if you just type in spring-loaded clips, because the way they label them is a little bit convoluted. So I went ahead and put a link for these right down in the video description. Not only do you need the clips, but you need a way to secure them. Now, if you know how to weld and you got a welder, just tack weld them on. I went to Home Depot and I got nuts, bolts, and washers. You need to make sure that they're labeled as stainless steel, not zinc and not brass. Zinc and brass can both leach harmful crap into your distillate. You need to go with stainless steel because it's, again, non-reactive. So I did some bolts, flat washers, some of these little spring washers, and some nuts. And that's pretty much all you need. So when you attach these clamps, you need to make sure that you account for the gasket material. What I did is I just took a little piece of the gasket material and I put it between the pot rim and the lid and held it in place, and then set my clamp on and measured how far down that was between the top of the clamp and the bottom of the pot. And then I just went a tiny bit lower, like 1 millimeter lower, when I was actually setting these holes for where I wanted them. It takes a little bit of fiddling, but you'll figure it out. So because the clamps are spring-loaded, they're actually kind of difficult to work with. You're going to need to open it up in order to mark the holes on the sides of your pot. I knocked loose the spring tensioner so that I could open the clamp freely, and I used that one clamp to mark all of my holes. So once you do that and you figure out your depth, go ahead and mark the screw holes for 4 to 6 clamps evenly spaced around the pot. When you drill the holes out, try to use the same size drill bit as the screws that are going to go in there, so there's not a lot of play and slop. It makes the holes a lot easier to seal up when you go to tighten them down. Then install the clamps using some of your gasket material inside the pot to prevent leaks, followed by a flat washer, a spring-loaded washer, and your nut. Get those all tightened down, and now it's time to install the pipes. So I'm just using 1/2-inch copper pipe, some elbows, some T-fittings, and some copper unions that correspond to the one on the condenser and the one on the line arm. Before you solder them on, make sure you got them in the right spot. These T-fittings are not actually part of the system, but I needed them to make a solid brace in between the inlet and the outlet pipe to make the whole thing a lot more sturdy and to protect it from any sort of lateral stress that may come from either side. Remember, this thing's gonna thump a little bit, so it's better if you've got a little brace in between there to keep things nice and solid. So these things have little metal stops on the inside that prevent you from sliding them all the way down the pipe, so that, you know, if you're using them the way you're supposed to, they only go over the end of the pipe. So if you want to use a bracing system like this, you're going to have to grind them out. And I just used my Dremel with a little stone grinder on it. You grind out the stops that are on the inside so that the T-fitting can slide all the way down. So once you get that done, you need to measure out your inlet pipe. You want there to be at least 1/4 to 1/2-inch gap between the bottom of this pipe and the bottom of the pot. So measure out however far that is, mark a line, and then decide how much you want sticking up above the pot. I went with 12 inches. For your outlet pipe, it only needs to protrude about 1/2 inch, about 1/4 to 1/2 inch because this is where all the vapor is going to escape from. So add that little tiny bit onto whatever extension you're going to have above the pot lid. So I didn't record this next part, but basically you got to figure out where you want the holes to be in the top of your pot lid, mark them. I used a stepped bit in order to drill them out, and I went really slow to make sure that I got the holes as close as I could to the diameter of the pipe. The tighter the better, because if you have too much sloppy gap around these joints, it's going to be a lot harder to solder them up. So if you have to kind of tap the pipes into place, that's fine. So fit your tubes into the holes where you want them, and double check your measurements so that you're positive you got them exactly where you want them. Add some liquid flux. If your lid material is super thin like mine was, it's better if you focus most of your heat on the pipes, because the lid will heat up on its own. Once you get the solder on there, make sure that it's flowed down into that joint. And you can see on the first attempt for me, it kind of beat it up. That's because I didn't have the pipes hot enough. I had the lid really hot, but not the pipes. Luckily, it was an easy fix, and I just had to apply heat straight to the pipes, and then the solder flowed down into the joint really well. And you can solder both sides, both the top and the bottom like I did, but just be careful that you don't apply too much heat and drip all of your solder out from the bottom while you're trying to do the top. So once that's cool, just slide your T-fittings into the position that you want them, then measure the space in between your T-fittings and cut a small piece of 1/2-inch pipe to fit in there. Make sure all the solder points are sanded before you put it together, then flux it and go ahead and solder it on the top and on the support bridge. You don't really need to bother with soldering the bottoms because it's not sealed, it's not connected to anything. Soldering on the top is fine, it's not going to go anywhere. So after that, you just need to solder on your elbows and your copper unions. And a little pro tip that I forgot about while I was soldering and then remembered after I finished. A lot of you guys gave me some excellent advice in the comments on my other build videos, and I forgot about it until after I'd finished. But basically, you keep a wet rag nearby, so as soon as you finish putting the solder on one of your connections, you can just take the wet rag and wipe the excess off, because you only need the solder that's on the inside of the joint. You don't need any on the outside. So I had to go back and reheat some of them that were gloopy and wipe them down, but it worked out. So once you get your soldering all done, just take some superfine steel wool and clean everything up. Get it all nice and shiny. Now you got to install your gasket material, because we need a way to keep liquid and vapor inside the pot and inside the pipes, not steaming out the sides. That would be bad. I used some of this PTFE joint sealant tape. This is basically the same kind of thread tape that you normally put on your pipe threads, but it's been expanded. It's big and chunky, and it's a little bit squishy. The cool thing about this stuff is that it cold molds. You don't have to get it hot. If you cut off a little square of this and squish it with your pliers, it makes a perfect gasket to go on your screw holes on the inside. When you put it around the rim and then clamp the lid down, it'll, you can kind of see that ridge in here. That just forms and it stays there. The frustrating thing about PTFE tape is that it does not melt together. You will not be making a solid contiguous gasket out of this stuff. It will not melt together like normal rubber or normal plastic. You can't do that with this stuff. PTFE doesn't melt, it burns, it chars. You may be wondering, why did I go with this stuff instead of like silicone? I did a lot of research on gasket material. Silicone will break down under acetone and acetaldehyde, two chemical compounds that are found in the heads of any distillation. It can potentially leach chemicals into your distillate that you don't want in there. When it comes to stuff like this, the best thing to do is look at what the commercial industry does. Generally, they're going to use PTFE gaskets. You can get PTFE gaskets made for tri-clamps. Those are easy to find. But when you need something custom size, this is what I found. So since you can't form it into one piece, I've got an end here. So what I did is I cut little lap joints so that the pieces overlap each other, and then I put them in place. So where the seams were, right here and right under here, this stuff shreds apart like regular PTFE tape. So I shredded some up and just laid some of those threads into those little joint connections, and it worked great. I had no leaks. It's a little fiddly. It's not perfect. We'll see if we can get to perfect at some point, but right now we have good enough. If you want to try this, I'll put the link for this down in the video description. It's between $20 and $30 for like 15 feet of it. The main thing is, for your gaskets, don't use bathroom silicone caulking or automotive silicone gasket maker. Don't do that. Don't do that. That stuff is full of chemical solvents that are needed to make that stuff cure. And it's just gonna leach horrible shit into your distillate. Please don't do that. The words you need to remember are non-reactive. Non-reactive components whenever you're building a piece for your still. If you don't want to use PTFE, you can use cork. At some of the craft stores, they have cork sheets. Cut out a gasket and use that, and that will do you just fine. Or flour and water paste. Make a flour and water rope, put that on top, close it up. The thing I like about this is if it does develop a leak, then I just put a little flour paste dab on it, no big deal. But I don't have to scrub a huge chunk of flour and water junk off of here every time. Not a perfect solution, but still pretty good. If I find something better, I'll make a new video on gaskets. All right, so now that we got this thing all done, and we got our clamps on, got our gasket material on, you need to check it for leaks. So fill it up with water, tip it upside down, tip it sideways, roll it around, and make sure that it's not leaking. If you find some leaks, keep those in mind. Maybe mark them with a little pen or something so that you know where you may end up having to put some flour and water paste. Do a water check, do an air check where you blow through and you listen for leaks, see if you can find any. You can spray some soap and water around the rim and the joints to see if you get any bubbles forming anywhere when you blow through the pipes. And then, obviously, after you do a vinegar run and a sacrificial alcohol cleaning run to get all the flux and junk out of the inside of the pipes, once it's clean, go ahead and do another leak check just to see if you developed any during the course of heating and cooling. I didn't think about that till now. So, aren't you glad that I'm getting all these mistakes out of the way for you? That's what I'm here for. All right, before we go over everything, I just want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys have been a tremendous help in keeping my new schedule going, and I could not be doing this without you. So thank you guys so much. And if you would like to help support my channel and get behind the scenes access for the crazy shenanigans I get up to around here, check out the link to my Patreon page in the video description. So you may already know this, but adding a thumper to your still increases the level of risk quite a lot, because when you add a thumper, you're closing that boiler off. You're making a closed system for that boiler because your outlet tube is underwater. So because there's that new layer of risk, there's some decisions you need to make on how to reduce that risk to protect yourself and your equipment. So if your still pukes, let's say you get it's foaming up, it's frothing up, you got a bunch of grain sediment in there, whatever. It pukes and then it gets lodged somewhere in your system. Now you've got a blockage in there. So since it's not an open system anymore, you've created pressure in your boiler. And if your boiler has pressure, you've basically got a bomb. And on the other side of the coin, when you turn the heat off, the liquid in the air is contracting quite a lot. And it creates a substantial vacuum inside your boiler. Now, if you're not running a thumper, there's no problems. But if you are running a thumper, it's sealed over here underneath the liquid. So it's gonna pull a strong vacuum on your boiler. You may think that that's not really a big deal. It'll just suck up and drain the liquid from your thumper. Yeah, maybe, but then again, maybe not. So here's my buddy George with a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
Matter of fact, check this out. What do you think? That still was 1 day old, assembled, and started up. He was just using water in it. He's just trying to get the feel for it. And had it running to temp and everything was fine. Decided he had, okay, I got it. Turned it off, walked out of the room to go make a sandwich. And during the time it took him to make a sandwich, when he came back, this is what he found. Yeah, a big crushed beer can.
So my point is, if you're going to add a thumper, you need a way to vent pressure and vacuum immediately. And there's a couple of really easy solutions for that, so don't freak out. First, you can add a pressure relief valve like this one. This one's only a 5 psi valve. I'm gonna put a link for it down in the video description if you wanna check it out. So if you build up pressure, that valve will pop and it'll let the pressure off. And it's also got that pull ring on it so that when you turn off the heat, just go up and pull that ring and it'll release any vacuum that's starting to build up in there. The other option is if you have a rubber stopper or a cork that you're using as a thermometer port for your column, just take it out. You know, if the pressure builds up, it's gonna pop out on its own. But when you turn off the still and you need to vent that vacuum, pull the cork out. Simple. Actually, speaking of thermometers, they're kind of pointless when you add a thumper to your system. The temperature of your vapor path in the still column is not going to be indicative of what's coming out of the spout because now you've got this big contraption in the way. And it throws things off and it creates a lot of lag between what's going on over here and what's coming out over there. George goes into a lot more detail about this kind of stuff in his Thumper videos, so I highly recommend you check him out. Lots of good info in those. Okay, so now that we know that thumpers add a layer of risk, we need to talk about how they change the process, because they add a layer of complexity to your process that you may not have anticipated. And because of that, my recommendation, if you're just starting out in this hobby, you haven't bought a still, you haven't built a still yet, don't add a thumper yet. For some of you, I'm sure that is exactly the opposite of what you want to hear, because you want to either do it the way the old timers did it, or you want to increase the ABV of your final product. I get it, but trust me, it's smarter and you'll make better product quicker if you learn how your still works without adding a thumper in, so you can get good at just distilling. So give yourself the advantage of time to learn how to do it, to make good spirits consistently, and then upgrade. You'll likely be doing this hobby for years because, quite frankly, it's awesome. So save yourself some room for upgrades in the future, because honestly, that's part of the fun. But you're gonna do what you're gonna do. Take my advice or don't. I'm not a cop. Okay, so let's get into some specifics about how adding a thumper actually changes your process. So if you normally use a PID controller and you're used to making cuts right off of the still based on whatever temperature is on here, adding a thumper is really going to mess your day up. You can't really make cuts that way anymore. As I said before, the temperature in the column is not what's going to be happening all the way through this complicated process of redistillation to give you an expected result on the other end. Everything it went through over there, it now has to go all the way through that again. So your temperatures are going to be off. Just go by your eyeball and do it that way. And you also can't really make cuts off the still. You're gonna have to collect in jars, 200 mils, and line up your jars, cover them with paper towel, let them sit overnight for 24 hours and air out. If you're not used to making cuts based on your senses, then you definitely need to let them air out for 24 hours, because that helps all the volatiles to kind of off gas, and it makes all the transitions a lot more distinct and easier to find. You gotta go old school. So no matter what you use to control the heat on your still, propane, a PID, an SCR power controller, it's going to take a little bit of fiddling to get that flow rate just right. And the adjustments that you make, you need to give them some time to settle in before you keep making changes, because everything has to go through this whole process before you see any sort of reaction down at the other end. So take your time. Okay, the last thing you need to make your thumper work really, really well, you need a way to diffuse the vapor that's coming out of your outlet pipe. Because the more you fraction those bubbles coming out, the smaller they are, the more the heat is going to disperse through the liquid, but also your vapor is going to spend more time in contact with the liquid inside the thumper. That will help to increase the distilling efficiency for what you're doing. My suggestion is very simply get some copper scrubbies, and you can just take a piece of copper wire, throw your scrubby up against it, and tie it on there. And if you get copper scrubbies from the grocery store instead of buying like copper, rolled copper scrubby material, make sure it says 100% copper on there, because normally these things are steel that are coated in copper, and that's kind of garbage because those will rust. All right, so that is my thumper build in a nutshell, probably a big nutshell. If Feel free to let me know of any changes you might recommend that I make to this. And if you've built a Thumper yourself, go ahead and give us some design details down in the comments, because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of people looking through the comments to get ideas for their own personal builds. So help out the community, give us some details. That would be really helpful for everybody, including me. Alright, so if you like this video, do me a favor and hit the like button, because it lets YouTube know that you're enjoying this kind of content so it can show it to more people, and it has the added benefit of making me feel better during the holidays. If you enjoyed this kind of content, you want to see more of it, do yourself a favor, hit the subscribe button right over here and the little bell icon right next to it. That way you get notified when I post new content. You know, I had a Christmas wish to get 100,000 subscribers so I could catch up with George and Jesse this year. That ain't gonna happen, but every little bit helps. Alright, thanks for watching. Talk at you later. Anybody notice this bubbling in the background? This has something to do with next week's video.